A poised black woman boards her flight. Just another day, another city, another meeting. But within minutes, the air shifts. A white pilot, with decades of power stitched into his uniform, confronts her for simply helping another passenger. His tone? Dismissive. His intent? Clear. He doesn't know who she is. Not yet. But just 24 hours later, he'll find himself stripped of his title, his reputation shattered, because the very woman he tried to belittle now sits on the committee that decides his fate. What happens next? It stuns everyone and sets off a reckoning the airline industry never saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And if you believe that respect should fly higher than prejudice, make sure to subscribe because this is just the beginning. It all started with a flight like any other. She walked with the kind of grace that wasn't taught, but inherited, born from generations that had to make dignity out of scraps. Dr. Lydia Ellison's heels clicked against the linoleum of Hartsfield-Jackson, like a drumbeat of memory, steady, unbending. Not many noticed her entrance, at least not the way you might notice a senator or a celebrity. But some did. And some looked too long, with eyes trained by habit to question what a black woman in a tailored suit, traveling alone in first class, could possibly be. Atlanta's airport is a strange place. It is a cathedral of movement, and yet a battlefield of stillness. The planes take off, the people board, but the old ghosts linger. The South doesn't forget. It simply dresses up in newer uniforms. Lydia passed a coffee stand. The barista smiled too brightly. The man in the next line nudged his wife, murmured something, then turned away. These were small things. But, my dear reader, especially those of you who've lived long enough to know, small things pile up like dust beneath the floorboard. One day the whole house creaks. By the time she reached her gate 12B, the air had shifted. It was subtle. The way the flight attendant's face tightened when Lydia handed over her digital boarding pass. The too fast glance, the pursed lip smile. It was the kind of politeness sharpened by suspicion. She took her seat near the window, folded her hands, waited. Then he entered. Captain Garrett Sloan. A man carved from confidence and old rules. His walk, his epaulets, his air of unchallenged authority, these things announced him before he even opened his mouth. And when his eyes found Lydia, something hardened. It was not recognized. No, it was that flicker, like a memory of something lost, or perhaps feared. And then it was gone. He passed by without a word, without a nod, as if she were a ghost. And yet, my friends, that is the cruelty of it. Not being seen is how one is marked. You see, this is not about loud slurs or snarled insults. This is about the slow knife. The look that says you don't belong here. The silence that makes a person question whether to speak at all. And Lydia, oh, she felt it. As you have, perhaps. As many of us have. Not always in airports, but in banks, in boardrooms, in church pews. She straightened her posture. She did not speak. She did not need to. Because what was brewing was older than either of them. It was the unfinished business of a country that taught some people to fly and others only to fall. And so this chapter begins, not with confrontation, but with quiet friction. Because racism in America, especially in these modern days, is often a whisper wrapped in policy, a shrug cloaked in protocol. But as you and I both know, it is always there. Beneath the pleasantries. Beneath the uniforms. Beneath the sky itself. Tell me, have you ever felt unseen in a place where you knew you belonged? Because Lydia had. And this was not the last time. It was only the beginning. The boarding call echoed through the terminal like a sermon half believed. People stood, some quickly, some cautiously. Lydia rose without hurry. She was never one to rush toward discomfort, though she had learned long ago it would find her whether she moved fast or slow. As she approached the jet bridge, a woman at the gate scanned her boarding pass and hesitated for half a breath. It was nothing. But again, everything. Lydia knew the moment well. The internal math white America still does. Black woman, solo, no husband nearby, first-class ticket, how? The agent handed her back the phone, a smile frozen tight like a polished doorknob. Lydia stepped forward. Inside the plane, cool air hummed from the vents. A young flight attendant with tired eyes offered her a smile, more sincere than the one at the gate. Lydia returned it, grateful for even the smallest kindness. She reached her seat. Aisle, first class. Neatly arranged. A symbol to some of having made it. But she knew better. To be Black in America is to know that even when you pay the same fare, the seat you take is never just a seat, it is a statement. As she settled in, a white man across the aisle glanced at her, then at her seat, then back to his phone. Lydia wondered if he was the kind who would complain later, saying she was given something she didn't earn. She smiled inwardly, not with pride, but with weariness. Moments later, she heard it, his voice. Captain Sloan. Welcome aboard Delta Flight 327, he said over the PA, his tone as polished and lifeless as the airline's logo. Estimated flight time is 2 hours, 20 minutes. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. Lydia caught something beneath the smoothness. Attention. A distaste buried deep in the tone. She had heard it before, in courtrooms, in banks, in the halls of so-called higher education. The voice of a man who spoke as though he were alone in the sky, above history, above scrutiny. A flight attendant came down the aisle offering drinks. Lydia asked for water. The man across from her ordered whiskey and made a joke, something crude about diversity hires in the cockpit. The attendant laughed nervously. Lydia said nothing. She had learned, through bruised experience, when silence said more than confrontation ever could. But silence is a strange companion. It can protect or suffocate. And on this flight, it began to thicken. A few rows back, a Latino family struggled to place a bag in the overhead bin. The father, speaking little English, tried to communicate. The attendant fumbled. Lydia stood up, not out of duty, but instinct. She translated. Calmly, clearly. The problem was resolved in seconds. The attendant smiled in relief. Thank you, ma'am, she whispered. That was a big help. But just then, Captain Sloan emerged from the cockpit. His eyes locked on Lydia. Saw her standing. Saw her speaking Spanish. Saw her helping. His jaw tightened. Everything all right here? He asked, voice clipped. Yes, Captain, Lydia replied, evenly. The family needed a little translation. He nodded curtly. Let's leave crew matters to the crew, he said, loud enough for the nearby rows to hear. Then turned and walked away. It was not the words, my friend. It never is. It was the tone. It was the implication. That she had overstepped. That her kindness was a threat. That her fluency, her competence, her very presence disrupted his order. Lydia sat back down. Calm, outside. But inside, an old wound stirred. This, too, she had seen before. The white man across the aisle chuckled behind his whiskey glass. Some people just need to be seen, huh? He muttered. Lydia turned her head slowly. Her gaze held his, not with fury, but with a depth that unsettled him. He looked away. The plane lifted off minutes later, but for Lydia, the weight remained. There are skies, she thought, that do not begin above us, but inside us. Skies of expectation, of prejudice, of silent wars waged in first class. And there are ceilings invisible, but crushing all the same. She took a slow breath, knowing this flight wasn't just about miles. It was about the altitude of the soul, and who was allowed to rise. The landing was smooth. Textbook, even. Passengers applauded half-heartedly, an old habit, like clapping at the end of a lie. Lydia didn't move right away. She stayed seated while others lunged for the overhead bins as if the journey had cost them more than money. She looked out the window at the gray edge of LaGuardia. New York waited beyond, brash and glittering, but she had no illusions. In cities like this, racism wore better suits. The flight attendant passed her and whispered, "Thank you again." For the translation earlier. Her smile was warm, her voice low, like they shared a secret. Lydia smiled back. But it wasn't a secret. It was survival. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, the air shifted again, not just in temperature, but in tone. She could feel eyes. Not everyone sees race, but many sense it, and some, like Captain Sloane, resent it like an old injury that never healed right. He stood at the terminal's edge, phone to his ear. When he saw Lydia, his posture stiffened, as though her presence demanded justification. He didn't speak, didn't nod, just turned away, his silence a verdict. Lydia walked past. Not hurried, not slow. She was not afraid of white men with uniforms and wounded pride. She had faced more dangerous men with less rank. Later that evening, in her Manhattan hotel, Lydia opened her laptop and began reviewing her presentation for the FAA's National Pilot Training Symposium. Her topic was clear: respect as a flight instrument, cultural competency, and in-flight safety. But her mind kept circling that moment in the aisle when her helping hand was met with suspicion. You see, the irony of America, especially for Black women who excel, is that competence is never just competence. It's a threat to the natural order. Her very fluency in Spanish, her calm under pressure, her being useful, these things weren't celebrated by Sloane. They were challenged. Because to men like him, order was not about safety. It was about control. The next morning, Lydia stood before a long table of FAA executives and airline compliance officers. Her heels did not tremble. Her voice did not waver. She began. Yesterday, I witnessed a moment. Small, quiet, but loaded. A captain bristled at my attempt to help a fellow passenger. He didn't thank me. He cautioned me. Because at that moment, his authority wasn't challenged by chaos. It was challenged by grace. And grace, coming from a Black woman, was more than he could bear. The room hushed. Not out of discomfort, but recognition. Many in that room were old enough to remember a time when captains weren't questioned at all. And some, truth be told, missed that time. But Lydia went on, her words climbing like pressure in a cabin. We've made airplanes safer by fixing engines, redesigning wings, and simulating storms. But the storm that occurs when a crew member can't see the humanity of a passenger, that storm we have yet to name. And until we do, all our safety records mean nothing. Afterward, a woman from Delta approached. Her name was Sylvia Grant, compliance lead, polished, corporate. She said, "Dr. Ellison, I think I know which captain you're referring to. Would you be willing to speak with our internal review?" Lydia looked at her, saw the mask of progress worn over a skeleton of caution. "As long as we're not talking about punishment," she said, "but about principle." Sylvia hesitated. "If it's more than one incident, it may have to be both." And there it was. The first true gust of consequence. A name, Captain Garrett Sloane, was now no longer a private discomfort, but a public concern. Lydia went back to her hotel that evening weary. Not from travel, but from truth. She knew the machine she had nudged. Airlines do not like disruption, even when it comes wrapped in logic and justice. But something in her had shifted. Maybe age. Maybe history. Maybe her father's voice whispered from a grave in Alabama. Don't let them make you small. So she sat in that quiet room, watching the lights of New York flicker like stars gasping for breath. And she prepared, for the real turbulence was only just beginning. There is a kind of silence that doesn't ask for peace. It demands compliance. Lydia knew it well. She had grown up with that silence, heard it in board meetings, in elevators, in the polite laughter of people who didn't know what else to do when a Black woman entered the room and refused to disappear. The morning after her FAA presentation, Lydia received a call from Delta's compliance office. Not a voice of rage. Not a voice of apology. A measured voice, professional, genderless, emotionless, like the hum of an engine designed to keep itself from overheating. We would appreciate a follow-up conversation regarding your account of events on Flight 327. She agreed. The next day, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking Midtown Manhattan, Lydia sat at one end of a long table. Across from her, 3 people, Sylvia Grant, now joined by an HR representative, and a quiet man in a suit whose name she forgot almost as soon as he said it. He was there not to speak, but to watch. To measure. To assess whether Lydia Ellison was going to be a storm or a passing cloud. Sylvia began, "We've conducted an internal review of Captain Sloane's record. There have been notes." She tapped a folder gently, as if it contained something fragile. Lydia nodded. "I'm not here to destroy a man's life," she said, "but I will not allow mine to be diminished in order to preserve his comfort." Sylvia blinked. That was the first crack. What followed was the performance of concern. The repeated affirmations of valuing diversity, the pledges to look deeper, the questions veiled as curiosity. "Do you feel the incident might have been misinterpreted? Is it possible he was just having a bad day?" My God, Lydia thought, how many bad days must a Black woman absorb before her own are considered? She answered every question with the precision of a surgeon, knowing that Black truth, when too raw, is seen as a threat, not testimony. And yet, she did not soften. She did not shrink. Her voice carried every century that brought her to that table. After the meeting, she stepped into the hallway and exhaled slowly. Her hands shook, but not from fear. From fury. From the ache of knowing that even when you're right, even when you're composed, even when you have the facts, they still make you prove your right to be heard. 2 days later, the whispers began. A colleague texted, "He's saying you overreacted." An old FAA acquaintance emailed, "They're reviewing your training protocols now, just so you know." A journalist reached out off the record, asking if she wanted to comment. Lydia did not flinch. But inside, a cold truth settled. America doesn't retaliate in fire. It retaliates in paper trails, in reassigned contracts, in reputational erosion so quiet you barely notice until it's too late. And still, she stood. Back in Atlanta, Captain Sloane was called into a separate review. He arrived with a polished smile and a lawyer in tow. His voice was steady, but brittle. "I don't see how this has gotten so blown out of proportion," he said. "I've flown for 20 years without incident. No one's ever had a problem before. And that, my friend, is the heart of the disease. If the wound never bleeds out loud, they call it healing." The HR officer read the flight attendant reports. One noted his tendency to dismiss non-English speakers. Another mentioned a comment about a Black co-pilot. Must be an affirmative action hire. Still, Sloane pushed back. Those were jokes. Misunderstandings. He called it bias, training fatigue. He said the words cancel culture. He said the words woke nonsense. But not once, did he say her name. Because naming a Black woman who holds power over your fate is to admit the game has changed. Delta's internal gears turned slowly. Too slowly. But the FAA moved faster. Lydia's influence, it turned out, was deeper than Sloane had realized. She didn't just teach policy. She helped write it. By the end of the week, a formal investigation was underway. Not just into Sloane, but into how the airline had handled similar complaints before. Whispers turned to reports. Reports turned into files. And the files, like kindling, began to smolder. Lydia sat on her balcony that night, sipping tea. Below, Atlanta glowed with the kind of beauty that only comes when pain and pride live on the same street. She thought of her father again. He once told her, "Baby, if they won't give you the mic, speak so loud they will hear you through the walls." And that's what she'd done. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't cursed. She had simply told the truth and let the silence tremble in its presence. Because there comes a time when silence itself becomes a kind of scream. And Lydia had learned to make it sing. There is something ancient in the way power resists truth. Not with fire, not with force, but with delay. With bureaucracy. with procedural indifference dressed up as caution. It stalls, it deflects, and it waits for the righteous to get tired. But Lydia Ellison was not tired. Not yet. The investigation was in motion. Captain Sloan was officially grounded, pending internal review. Delta's legal team, tight-lipped and irritable, now danced with the FAA under a scrutiny they hadn't prepared for. Lydia, meanwhile, found herself both respected and resented. She had become, in a single breath, a hero to some and a problem to others. She received emails from flight attendants, some anonymous, some not, thanking her. "We've all seen it," one wrote, "but we never knew someone with your power would actually say it aloud." And still, the other kind of messages came, too. Subtle. Measured. A speaking engagement was cancelled due to scheduling conflict. A delayed contract renewal, pending departmental realignment. A colleague, once warm, now distant. "I just hope this doesn't become a witch hunt, Lydia." A witch hunt. That old American phrase. One that's always used when someone's finally held accountable for something everyone else has long known but feared to name. And that's what we must understand. Racism in the air doesn't always arrive with a hood or a slur. Sometimes it comes in emails without greetings. In voicemails that end without "thank you." In chairs pulled slightly further away at the conference table. Lydia sat in another FAA briefing that week, watching her own slides on cultural sensitivity being dissected, not for improvement, but for implication. Had she been too pointed? Too political? Too aware? One man, older, balding, spoke gently but firmly. "Dr. Ellison, we all agree on the need for inclusivity, but I wonder if introducing racial language into safety protocols dilutes the technical rigor we're known for." She looked him in the eye. "Sir, the Wright brothers didn't just fly a plane, they reimagined gravity. And if we can redesign metal to fly, we can reimagine how human beings treat one another inside of it." The room stilled. But behind the stillness, the resistance grew. That week, Captain Sloan appealed his suspension. Claimed the incident was exaggerated. That Lydia had a professional agenda. That she was weaponizing her influence. These weren't new accusations. Just new suits on old ghosts. He stood in front of the review board, his voice low and measured. "If I lose my wings over a misunderstanding, then this industry has truly lost its spine." But what Slogan did not know, what men like him never knew, is that some spines bend not from weakness, but from carrying the weight of a country's contradiction. Lydia was invited to attend the hearing. Not required, but invited. She accepted. Not out of vengeance, but necessity. When she entered the room, Sloane's posture changed. Not fear, just the recognition that the person he had dismissed was now part of the decision that could end his career. She did not gloat. She did not glare. She sat still. The way her grandmother used to sit in church, solemn, watchful, prepared. The panel asked questions. Why did Captain Sloan confront Dr. Ellison? Why did he imply she'd overstepped her role as a passenger? Why were there past reports, though uninvestigated, that echoed this same tone, this same impatience with accents, with women, with blackness itself? Sloan spoke. Said it was misinterpreted tone, that things have gotten too sensitive. That he meant no harm. But America's long history of harm has always hidden behind the words "I meant no harm." Then they asked Lydia to speak. And she did. "Respect," she said, "is not a suggestion at 35,000 feet. It is a safety protocol. If a man cannot control his prejudice, he cannot control his aircraft. And it's not about who he meant to hurt. It's about who he believes is not worth protecting." The words settled into the silence like stone into still water. And in that silence, the system looked back, not at Lydia, but at itself. Because that's the thing about confronting racism in America. The moment you name it, everyone else must decide whether they will ignore it or be changed by it. Garrett Sloan sat in the waiting room of the operations center, staring at the floor like it had answers he hadn't been taught to read. His hands were still, his flight cap resting on his lap like a relic from another time. He had once worn that cap like a crown. Now it felt like a paperweight, holding down the memory of a man he could no longer pretend to be. He wasn't afraid of losing his job, he was afraid of losing what it had meant. In America, the uniform has always been a symbol. It promises belonging, authority, and for some, especially men like Sloane, it promises protection from scrutiny, from consequence, from the very world changing beneath their feet. But what happens when the uniform no longer hides the man inside? That morning, Sloane was summoned to a final meeting. No cockpit, no co-pilot, no gate announcement. Just a small conference room with a paneled wall, a table too clean, and the final breath of a long-ignored truth. Across the table sat his manager, a legal advisor, an HR officer, and an observer from the FAA. They didn't rush. Power never rushes. The legal advisor began. Captain Sloane, after a thorough investigation and in consideration of both prior conduct and the most recent incident involving Dr. Lydia Ellison, the airline has made its determination. The word determination landed like thunder in a room where no one had raised their voice. You are hereby relieved of active duty with Delta Airlines, effective immediately. Your employment is terminated for violation of conduct standards, including behavior interpreted as discriminatory and hostile toward a passenger under federal protection. Sloane blinked. Once, then again. The words weren't shocking. What shook him was the fact that they'd finally been said. He had always counted on the silence, on the unspoken rule that as long as you kept the plane in the air, no one would ask what you did with the people inside it. But that day, silence failed him. And at the bottom of that silence was Lydia's name. She hadn't spoken it in anger. She had spoken it in clarity. And clarity, when it comes from a Black woman, is a dangerous thing in a country still allergic to her authority. They handed him a letter. His termination, official. The FAA's pending review noted. And there it was in crisp font at the bottom. Dr. Lydia Ellison, FAA consultant, signature of compliance approval. Her name. Not in vengeance, but in justice. Sloane didn't speak. His mouth moved, but only fragments formed, justifications half-born and half-buried. I didn't mean I never saw her as you're blowing this out of. But even his own voice betrayed him now. He walked out of the building like a man disarmed. The corridors, once familiar, now echoed like halls of judgment. The people he passed, security, admin staff, a young trainee, did not greet him. They offered the polite glance given to someone you've already read about in an internal memo. And isn't that the final wound of racism? Not the confrontation, but the cold realization that the rules did apply. That the armor built of tenure and metrics and quiet bigotry was no match for truth once it got a microphone. Back at his home, Sloane removed the framed photos of his first flight, his captain's badge, his commendations. Not because he felt guilt, but because he could no longer stand to look at them without hearing her voice, calm and assured, stating what he had refused to see. If you cannot see me, you cannot see your passengers. And if you cannot see your passengers, you are flying blind. Meanwhile, Lydia sat in her Atlanta apartment, not celebrating. There was no joy in watching a man unravel. But there was a quiet sense of gravity. She hadn't destroyed him. He had done that long ago. She had only pulled back the curtain. She received more messages now. Some from pilots of color, whispering thanks. Some from passengers reliving their own subtle humiliations. And one, and signed, that read only. I wanted to say, I'm sorry. I don't know how else to begin. She didn't need to know who wrote it. She knew. And still, the work continued. Because Sloane was not the only one. He was just the first to face the storm. And in this country, your country, our country, storms don't always signal endings. Sometimes, they clear the sky for something better. There's a peculiar loneliness that comes with being right in a world built on denial. It is not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of clarity, of seeing what others refuse to see, of hearing what others drown out with polite conversation and patriotic noise. Lydia Ellison had become a name whispered across boardrooms now. Not in scandal, but in unease. Some called her brave, others dangerous. She had not burned anything down, but somehow the smoke still followed her. That's how it works when a Black woman tells the truth without asking permission. In the weeks after Captain Sloan's termination, Lydia was invited to panel after panel. CNN wanted a soundbite. The Washington Post asked for an op-ed. Universities wanted her to keynote. Airlines wanted her insight, most of them, if we're honest, only to prove they were listening. But Lydia had no time for performance. She was too busy working. She and her team began revising national training protocols. New modules were introduced: bias recognition in flight crews, cultural humility in crisis scenarios, language, tone, and power in high-altitude spaces. Yet with every new policy she helped design, the resistance thickened, not from white supremacists with burning flags, but from middle managers with fake smiles. From executives who said, "We support this," and then quietly strip the budget. From old friends who now say, "You've changed." Of course she had. To name injustice is to be changed by it. She visited a regional training facility one morning, a concrete box in Missouri lined with simulators and motivational posters. She watched an instructor, a white man maybe in his 50s, fumble through her new curriculum. His tone was boring. His slides are outdated. When a Black flight attendant in the back asked how to handle subtle prejudice from a captain, the instructor shrugged. "Just keep it professional." Lydia stood up from the back row. "Professionalism," she said, "is too often a word used to silence those who are already surviving in silence." The room stilled. She had not raised her voice. She had only raised the temperature. The instructor blinked. "I didn't mean anything by it." "You never do," she said, and walked out. That night, in her hotel room, Lydia sat alone. No applause. No article. Just her reflection in the window and the knowledge that the deeper you push into truth, the colder the rooms become. She scrolled through her phone. Messages kept coming. "A Black pilot from Denver. Your story gave me the courage to file my own report." "A white flight attendant from Ohio. I didn't realize how much we let slide until I heard you speak." "A woman from Mississippi. My daughter wants to be a pilot." She keeps your picture on her wall. And still, with every message came the shadow. She overheard a senior director call her polarizing. One consultant said she was too emotional. A union rep warned her to pace herself. That is the burden. To fight for equity is to become inconvenient to the very systems you're trying to save. She called her mother that evening, told her about the week, about the new curriculum, about the cold stares and careful claps. Her mother, who had taught in a segregated school in Montgomery, said, "Child, they won't thank you while you're building the road. They'll wait till it's paved, then name it after someone else." Lydia smiled. A tired, knowing smile. Because some days, being Black in America feels like living in a house you keep repairing while your neighbors complain that the hammer is too loud. The next morning, Lydia gave a presentation to the FAA National Board. Her data was airtight. Incident reports down. Passenger satisfaction is up. And still, one board member, an older white man with too many pins on his lapel, asked, "Do you think we're focusing too much on identity politics?" She looked at him the way her grandmother used to look at fools in the pulpit. And she said, "Sir, identity isn't politics. It's visibility. And in aviation, visibility keeps us from crashing." A silence followed, not defensive this time, reverent. Because deep down, even those who resist truth often know it when they hear it. That day, Lydia walked out of the building not triumphant, but unbroken. And that, perhaps, is the greatest victory we can ask for in a country that still makes survival feel like rebellion. Time passed, but not easily. In America, change comes slow, like winter light through the blinds of a prison cell. And for those who dare to speak it aloud, who refuse to bend their dignity to someone else's comfort, the cost is always high. Always. Lydia Ellison knew this. She wore the cost the way some wear medals. Not out of pride, but out of memory. It had been nearly a year since Captain Garrett Sloan lost his wings. His name no longer echoed through terminals. He became a whisper, a cautionary tale swapped over break room coffee, his photo quietly removed from the wall of legacy flyers. But the wound he left behind had not scabbed over. It had been examined, stitched with policy, and, for the first time, left open to air. Lydia stood now in a hangar outside Dallas, watching a group of young recruits, diverse, sharp-eyed, eager to fly. They studied not just lift and thrust, but human behavior. One simulator module bore her name in small print at the bottom: Ellison Protocol, Conflict Resolution in Cabin Space. She didn't ask for the name. Someone else had put it there. One trainee, a young black woman with cornrows tucked neatly beneath her cap, approached Lydia. "Dr. Ellison," she said, voice steady, "I just want to thank you. I heard what you did, what you stood for." Lydia smiled gently. "It's your sky now," she said. "Fly it with eyes wide open." But even as progress took root, the resistance persisted. There were still captains who grumbled about soft-skill training. Still, airline executives wondered, quietly, if Lydia's work had gone too far. There were still passengers who stared too long, who questioned too much, who asked for someone in charge when the person in charge didn't look the way they expected. Because racism, in this America, is not an event. It's an atmosphere. But atmospheres can change. That summer, Lydia was asked to testify before a congressional subcommittee on aviation ethics. A high-stakes room, carpet too thick, eyes too sharp. She stood behind a slim wooden podium, the weight of centuries pressing into her spine, and she did not bend. She told them what she had seen, what she had endured, and what she had done. Not with bitterness, with clarity. "Safety," she said, "is not just about equipment. It's about the environment. And a cockpit poisoned by prejudice is as dangerous as one crippled by mechanical failure." One congressman scoffed, said, "Aren't we overreacting to an isolated incident?" She looked at him with the full authority of her ancestors and replied, "Sir, in this country, Black people have been called overreactors since the first time we screamed under the boot. But I assure you, this is not a reaction. This is my response. This is accountability." Her testimony went viral. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. She returned to Atlanta that night, sat alone on her balcony. Above her, planes crossed the dark sky like prayers. She watched one, Delta, maybe, cut a clean white line through the stars. She wondered if Garrett Sloan had ever looked up since the fall. Wondered if he finally understood that the cockpit was not a throne. That the sky does not belong to those who fear difference. That some wings were clipped not by sabotage, but by arrogance. And then, as if summoned by memory itself, she received an anonymous message. "I wanted to hate you. For what happened. For how it ended. But I've been reading. I've been doing the work. I'm still angry, but I'm less blind. Thank you, Dr. Ellison." "I'm sorry." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Some reckonings are quiet. Some forgiveness, too. Lydia closed her eyes. Let the night hold her. In her mind, she thought of her father's old words, spoken long ago from a rocking chair on a creaky porch. "You keep standing, baby. Even when the wind rises. Even when they pretend not to hear. 'Cause one day, they'll have to answer to the sky." And now, for the first time in her life, Lydia believed that day was coming. Not fast. Not all at once. But coming, because the sky remembers. And it keeps score in silence.